human is denied every day to hundreds of millions of people.
Dans ce temple des Nations Unies, nous sommes les gardiens d'un idéal. Nous sommes les gardiens d'une conscience. La lourde responsabilité et l'immense honneur qui sont les nôtres doivent nous conduire à donner la priorité au désarmement dans la paix.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop.
Chaque génération, sans doute, se croit vouée à refaire le monde. La mienne sait pourtant qu'elle ne le refera pas. Mais sa tâche est peut-être plus grande. Elle consiste à empêcher que le monde se défasse.
Okay, welcome everyone back to our third and last session of our day, legal day for the Masterclass Global Actor for Peace. I'm really glad to see that everyone is there. Looking forward to this double interview that I hope will be as enjoyable as we imagine. So thank you very much again to our distinguished speakers for being with us. Anne Peters, Director of the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, that we met this morning. Professor Mauro Bussani, Professor of Comparative Law at the University of Trieste, Macao, and the Faculty of Law of the Católica Global School of Law. Welcome back. Welcome for this very last session that has an original format. This is how we imagine the conclusion of this dense day, where we had international law perspective, comparative law perspective, and we thought it would have been an interesting exercise to put these visions, ideas, concepts together in a conversation that is imagined as a very informal one. Really, as we said before, we can imagine something in front of the fireplace, trying to discuss together topics that are at the heart of your academic thoughts, of our general interest, of us as our students, as well as human rights students, and so on. So I prepare a list of questions I imagine as a very dynamic exchange. So I will try to be brief. I would kindly ask you to be brief as well in order to have as many questions as possible in the first part with me and in the second part with the rest of the audience. So the idea is really like to try to reason together and to put together different visions from comparative law and international law of common problems we discuss over the day, and to see similarities, convergence, divergences of your understanding of common problems. So thanks again for being with us, and I would start immediately with the very first question. That is a very general question. So we used to hear a lot about the end, the crisis, the demise of the state, globalization weakening the world of yesterday. And still we live in a world of states that looks to be quite in a good health. There is not a real challenge to the paradigm. Actually, there is perhaps even a resurgence of the state in which Westphalian attributes, and I will say Eastphalian attributes this morning. So sovereignty, independence, territory, the violence of borders is there. New representatives of this international ethos that we mentioned several times today, China and Russia, are there. What do you think about the resurgence of the state? Is true? Is apparent? Is the state back? Anne, ladies first.
Okay, that's a double-edged sword now. Okay, the renaissance of the state. Well, the state was never gone. Even not in the heydays of hyperglobalization. And, but I think it is still correct to speak of the modification of the state, that the state has become different. Even now, we have seen, as I also mentioned this morning, the reflexes of border closures in the pandemic. But after some thinking also of governments, borders have become open again and given place to sophisticated schemes of exit entry with quarantine and so on. So I think that statehood is continuously transforming itself. And even when states like Russia and China in their joint declaration put state sovereignty in the first place, they still have to reckon with the reality of global supply chains. The pandemic exactly showed the interdependence. For example, factories in India had to dismiss the workers because the orders from the northern states were canceled. So they are linked together still, and ever more, I think.
Thanks. Mauro?
I think that there is a clear difference between Western democracies and the rest. Even the rest is divided within itself. Western democracies, the state in Western democracies, as in all this, I want to start with saying that I agree with Anne in the sense that given that things never change, things always change, and the law never stays put, there's always a dynamism in the process of evolving, of looking at the phenomena, a dynamism which we always take into account. Being that said, the state in the Western democracies has long become a sort of a local agency for the implementation of global orders, nothing more and nothing less. Of course, there are some sectors like welfare, health, education, to a certain extent, even legal education, that has remained deeply domestic, deeply national, even though these are sectors affected by the global orders as well, because we've seen with the pandemic and the supply chains and the disruption and the new modifications of the supply chains that dictated by the pandemic. This is in the West. Outside the West, we should in turn cast a different eye on what are what Westerners call authoritarian regimes like Russia and China, and societies in which the state, as we are used to shaping, are very different from ours, in the sense that wherever there is an Islamic rule, the state has a role different from than what it has in the Western democracies. In sub-Saharan Africa, the state has traditionally a role that is strongly dependent on ethnic subdivisions and imaginary borderlines designed by the colonizers in the recent past. So, of course, there are states that are stronger states that are weaker outside the West. What I think is a common thread looking at the West is the demise of the state as we were accustomed to think of it.
Allow me one more question about the state. The state probably has been the long-lasting form of colonial legacy. What was born as a European model has been successfully exported around the world, becoming a global model and still bringing with it this very Eurocentric identity, mirroring European models of political organization. So what I was wondering, is the state as a paradigm the problem of many global governance issues? Is the state the original scene of international law?
Excuse me, Valentina, I didn't get the last words of your question.
See, is the state the original scene of international law?
Oh, this is a good question for Anne.
But I want to hear also
well,
from
the state is the birth of international law, not the original sin, but international law, as we now define it, is co-emergent with the birth of the nation state made in Europe. Maybe that's what you allude to.
Mm-hmm.
So we should also see that it is a fairly new phenomenon, recent phenomenon. We can't exactly say when it was born, but in a period, an extended period, and Westphalia is only a symbol, totally simplified. So yes, in a way, the state is the starting point, and if whether you think it is a sin or a virtue, that of course depends on how you see the pros and cons of the current international order as it is.
Very little to add to what Anne said. I just stressed that the term international is really an outdated adjective to describe the field. And it carries on with it the Westphalian origin of the term, which is largely unfit to describe even the field that Anne and all the international lawyers study, because international is something that is gone. I don't know if for good, but it's totally gone.
I think we agree definitely in this statement. And about the law and the state now probably is the question. So the identification between law and state law has been, again, one of the biggest legacy of positivism, and maybe one of the biggest battle of Mauro Bussani, probably, and Anne as well, of course. So the state as a paradigm has been the basis of what we said, and perhaps the limit for thinking the same international law and comparative law for a long time. Both of you have in common the idea of the challenge of thinking law beyond the state. And I want to ask you why it's so important to think law beyond the state, and how this would affect legal curricula. And this is, I go where what Mauro was also raising briefly before, and the way of understanding law. We have many law students here, and I think it can be an interesting question.
And that's for Mauro in the first place, definitely.
yeah, but I don't know if Valentina allows me to speak for 3 hours in a row. Otherwise, I would limit to a sort of bullet points, because coming from the answers that we gave to your first questions, it's quite clear that whatever the position, the perspective, the state controls. Even in China, even in the United States, so I'm speaking of big states in demographic, economic, military, and geopolitical terms, controls only partially the real world they pretend to rule and or to affect. Trade, navigation on the sea, on the rivers, aviation, the value of currency, the value of energy sources, not to mention finance, and I could go on and on and on and on, are all fields that are unregulated or are not regulated at all by the states, not because they wouldn't want to, but because they cannot do that. So thinking of the state as the primary source of the law is something that is very convenient to the academic role game, to the professional role game, to the politicians' role game, even for constitutional courts to think of in these terms. But the reality speaks a different language, speaks a language where the supply chains mentioned by Anne are scattered and distributed across the continents, speak of a language where the finance is dramatically globalized in a way that is out of control of local, meaning by local, domestic, and regional authorities, where the media have, social media have a power absolutely unknown in the past, even in allowing or denying freedom of expression. I don't want to enter into the Trump Twitter issue, even though I would have something to say. But this is simply the upteenth proof of how globalized and interconnected is the world, for the ill and for the good. For the ill and for the good. I'm not a worshipper of the globalization as we have experienced it so far, but I'm not either someone who thinks of a return to the past just like that. So studying, and to come to the final sentence of your question, addressing the students, studying domestic law is fine because all states do need domestic lawyers, not only for government advice, not only for the ongoing framework of academic structures, but also and especially because there are a lot of weak people who need to go before the court claiming housing rights, claiming labor rights, claiming welfare rights. And these are the weakest part of the population. And these are the people who usually go to the tribunals, to go before the court, because all starting from the medium to the big enterprises, not to mention multinationals, they already never go to the court. Mm-hmm. But for defending, for asking injunctions, defending IP rights, or challenging arbitral awards. Mm-hmm. They do not go to court. The people who go to court in the West is more and more people who claim their basic rights. So we do need good domestic lawyers. But if we think of the law as it is and as it develops, and if we think of making money, domestic law is just a part, and most of the times a minor part of what your education needs, what your legal education needs. I'm sorry for being long, Anna.
We waited. I was expecting the 3 hours, so you've been really short now. Okay, I think Mauro, you exposed yourself here as a radical or a strong pluralist, saying that the states cannot regulate the totality of our globalized life sphere, even if they wanted to. But I think that lots of people would maybe not share the analysis, but respond to you that in the end, it is still the states, even if one state can't do it alone, it is still states acting together which leave the space and which authorize through their legislation or structure, authorize the fact that these non-state made other forms of law, you mentioned religious, ethnic, that this will somehow be accepted, acknowledged, and have some normative force. So I think a lot of people would not subscribe to this radical pluralism, saying that law emerges out of society and that the other lawmakers are as legitimate as the state as a lawmaker. But they would say that, well, we have a question of legitimacy when these other forms of laws, which are taken from holy scripts or from ancient customs and so on, they do not have the pedigree as a law which emerged out of a proper democratic process in which a group of people decides to give to themselves the law. I mean, this is the ideal. We all know that democracy often doesn't function well, but that's at least the theory behind it, which I find attractive, I must say. And there the state, the Western model of a well-functioning democratic state under the rule of law, I think looks better to me than some Islamic Sharia thing, I must say. Sorry for being a bit simplistic.
Yeah. Of course, Mauro, you have to react.
I need a rebuttal time because first, I don't look at myself, maybe I'm wrong and you are right, but I don't look myself as a radical, not to mention a radical pluralist. I'm trying to analyze the word. It's my fault if you misunderstood me. This is out of question. But I was not talking about what the mainstream legal discourse call social norms. That are not social norms at all, are rules in and of itself. But I was not talking about that. I was talking about state. And I was saying that the state, even if it pretends or would wish to control the reality, it does not. And I was listing a series of fields from trade to aviation, to navigation, to fishing, to food, to chemicals, to nuclear energy, to the value of currency, to energy sources, to finance, to trade as a whole, which are denationalized and has been denationalized for a long time. Whatever Germany, Italy, or the EU want to say about navigation, aviation, fishing, food, yes, it can do, but it has to go through international conventions or global arrangements.
But that's still interstate then. That's interstate among states.
Wait, that's the point. That's the point. My point is that besides welfare, health, education, and justice, to the extent the justice services is provided to the big actors, which is not most of the times. Besides that, the state is becoming more and more the local public agency which implements global or out-of-state orders. Even if you think of the European Union members, I had in the past, I've not updated data, but I don't think that the data have changed very much. The legislator in France, Germany, Italy produce from 50 to 65% of their own legislation, either in order to implement EU directives or other kind of instruments, or to adapt former domestic legislations to EU recommendations, regulations, and so what does it mean? That we all Germany does not, Germany, France, Italy, state do not exist any longer. No. I'm not radical. I'm not a pluralist in this sense. I'm watching, I'm trying to study the dynamics which is supporting the transformation that you mentioned of the state in directions that are not fully acknowledged by the public discourse, by the public, I mean, by the mainstream scholarly discourse. And in the domestic and in the international arenas. Of course, there are a degree of awareness on this and that field, on that, or more generally. But I mean, you use me indirectly, or I feel used to come back to Twitter and Mr. Trump. I partially looking at the debate that this issue arose, I lean towards Madame Merkel, Angela Merkel, saying that, wait a second. This is not, the freedom of expression is not something that can be conculcated this way. This is my first reaction. As a citizen, if you want. As a jurist, I have to take into consideration that Twitter, or Facebook, whatever global social media, are linked with their users by a contract. And the contract states quite clearly which are the limits that cannot be overcome. Then there can be a matter of interpretation of these limits, and then you go to court. So the automatic cultural and political reaction of Madame Mrs. Merkel and of myself, because as I said, I had this automatic reaction. I agree. I even said before Merkel with some colleagues and friends. But when I read Merkel, I was happy. I said, this is the reaction a statesman, a stateswoman should have. My second thought was, wait a second. Because I recently saw a dispute with Facebook on different issues. And what was drawn to my attention is that they are bound by a contract, and the contract sets the limits. And the limits can be, of course, disputed. But you have, if you want to dispute, you go to the court. There's no legislator. You see, this is my final point. There's no state which, as itself, in and of itself, intervenes to regulate freedom of expression or freedom of association. No. You go to the court if you want. The court is a state one. Yes, okay. This is a justice service provided by the state. One of the fields in which the state still has its ruling control.
Okay. I would suggest, unless Anne has really something on this, but I think maybe we can, because I mean, I think many of these issues will also reemerge, and probably we can continue with something that we hear quite a lot over the day, and probably there are some questions also in the audience concerning that. So the Liberal Trinity and also the general backlash against liberalism that we saw in our conversations today. And Anna, you wrote that human rights, democracy, and rule of law are the benchmarks for the critique of international law as it stands, but this is also true at the end for any other legal system, probably, the way in which we measure the world. So I actually have three questions for the three of them. So for human rights, for democracy, and rule of law. So concerning human rights, and I will start with that, it's probably the element of the Liberal Trinity that is more predicated on the individual, also problematically, because if I should really find a difference between the Western and the non-Western legal tradition, I would find the individual as the distinguished element. So the human rights discourse seems, in my eye, expansive on the way and decay on the other hand. And my question would be, also in the light of what we said this morning, how you can revitalize the human rights discourse. Is it really so aversive to imagine to have a kind of hierarchy of human rights? Of course, you mentioned that in the in the Trump administration, where everything is, of course, suspicious, and I wouldn't trust this kind of hierarchy made by Trump. And of course, Mauro was rightly said this afternoon, then the question is who decides? So I know that there are many questions related to that, but why we cannot imagine really to have concentric circles of human rights? Or it's really important to say that they are so impossible, undivisible? Or generally, how we can revitalize this discourse that seems in need to be revitalized in any case?
Okay, maybe I can start on that one, and Mauro can surely add. So first of all, you asked the question of hierarchy as a solution against the attacks. And so maybe the premise of your question is that there has been an inflation, an exaggeration and overreach of human rights. Mm-hmm. And this is what critics also attack. It is true that in recent times, many new so-called human rights have come up, partly in reaction to new threats. And I think that this is justified. For example, digitalization, new media have brought about new threats for privacy. And therefore, I think it is good to conceptualize a human right on erasure in the internet, for example. Mm-hmm. So this is a kind of expansion which I find good. Mm-hmm. You also hear and read about a right against corruption, a right to the city, mm-hmm. a right to breastfeeding mm-hmm. is something which I also read about. Mm-hmm. So here then comes the critique and says, if everything is a right, or a right to microcredit financing, then nothing is a right in the end anymore. Mm-hmm. So I think that we have to take this reproach of inflation seriously. But there are different types of problems. I think one issue, the right to the city, the right against corruption, the right to a clean environment. Here, I think maybe the problem is that the issue, the problem, the harm is a structural issue of infrastructure, the state, the whole setup, and that there are maybe doubts whether the individualized strategy that one person claims that this is my right, that the individualized strategy doesn't fit. So that is, I think, a thing where one has to think about. And my other response has been that, especially in international law, our legal analysis is much too primitive. We want to give the individual a place, and it has a place in international law. And the only vessel we have is human rights in international law speak. Mm-hmm. And I think it should be much more refined, that there may be subjective legal positions and rights, but they're not necessarily human rights. More like an administrative law. We don't call everything a human right. If I have some claims against the neighbor and so on, I mean, or a private law, we have a lot of different types of entitlements in domestic law. And I think international law must become much more sophisticated in that regard, because otherwise we have this problem of human rights inflation, which mm-hmm. then debases the whole idea, which mm-hmm. is bad.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Anna. Mauro?
Yeah, I talked a bit about this in the first afternoon session. I fully agree with Anna that the inflation has made the whole discourse less sharp, less useful as it should be. But it's also true that even before the big inflation, there should be an acknowledgement that not all the human rights are complied with or fulfilled, even in the West. And because I think especially of social and economic rights that have a different degree of implementation in the Western, even in Europe, not only in the States, on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a caveat that I try to raise this afternoon, in the first part of this afternoon. That's to say, what are we talking human rights for? In the sense that, are we speaking of human rights because we want to export them where we think that they do not exist, or they do not exist in a firm way, with a firm basis? or we're talking about West and the way in our societies human rights should be respected more and better protected and so forth, because the perspectives are very, very different. What links the two perspectives? Speaking of outside the West, I try to give some answers in the first part of the afternoon. Speaking about the West and speaking about the rest, I think that something that has always been neglected or overlooked is that whenever we speak of right, and I think this was implicit in what Anne was saying. I don't know if I'm translating in my language in an appropriate way, but wherever there is a right, there's a duty on the other side. And we do not all simply have to single out the rights we're talking about and the setting in which we would like to have these rights implemented, but also who carries the duty to meet the needs that are at the base of the human rights we're talking about. There are a lot to say more than that, but I leave room for
in this sense, while we're also waiting that Anne reconnects, Sonia was asking in the chat, can be based on local human rights tradition, Charte du Mandé in Mali, Ubuntu in South Africa, a way to reappropriate local human rights without.
I fully agree with Sonia. I fully agree with Sonia. This is the perspective on which I would look, and I did look at the human rights. I mean, leaving aside the catchword, human rights, which is very useful to Western discourses, Western political and geopolitical discourses in various directions, which are not always sanctified by the can I say, by the values underpinning human rights. This is the way we should look at them. What kind of human rights are felt by the local populations? And being always aware, as I said in replying to Marguerite this afternoon, that we should be aware of what we speak about when we talk about local populations. Because one thing is what we think there is the local population, usually meaning the elites, English-speaking people who live in this or that country because they are able to communicate with us, or the local population taken as a whole. And how we estimate and evaluate what the local population wants. And the original question is that should arise at the very foundation of Sonia's perspective, which I, as I said, fully share, is why we? Why should we be the ones who evaluate which are the human rights? I mean, because we take Westphalia and the state, as we said, as a sort of icon of paradigm, but wherever and whenever we talk about ourselves. When we speak about other states, why are they not free? South Africa, Mali, Central African Republic, Senegal, Cameroon, whatever, Indonesia, Malaysia, whatever, whoever. Why aren't they free to choose for their own human rights? Because this is something that I wanted to get into when we spoke about the state. I take advantage of this perspective just to say a few words. I mean, when we speak of states, we are always very indulgent with thinking of our states as a necessity that has to resist one way or another. But what about the other states? And the other states where we would like to transplant, to prod the legal rules, to prod legal reforms, to impose legal reforms. So, are they states? I mean, let me stop here.
That's passionating. Anna, unfortunately, is having some connection problems that I hope she will solve. She just wrote me, but I would continue with the second leg of our liberal democratic paradigm. And this is, of course, democracy that remain a bit in the back of our conversation today. And still has been somehow at the core of many of your reflection. I mean, of course, global constitutionalism for Anne has been, here we go. Welcome.
Okay, I'm back.
Wonderful, welcome back.
Sorry.
No problem. Happy that you solved it.
Valentina,
yeah.
Just one point for Mauro Bussani. Just an answer why the world is like that, because we don't forget, but unfortunately the international system is still I add this word in English, hierarchical. As
you said, I agree with you. But I mean, when we speak of state, we speak in principles of the old principle of the equality of the states, right? In the international community. But as a matter of fact, it's not like that. I mean, it has never been like that. It's never been like that. So when we speak about states, we worship a sort of outdated icon that is still functioning in many sectors, no doubt. But we don't respect the same form of state when we speak about the rest of the world. So we allow ourselves to speak of human rights outside the West. Why aren't they states that can control this kind of issue? No. Why not? Because we are animated by what I called, on the wake of anthropologists, expansive ethnocentrism. So wherever we lay our eyes upon, we should see the same kind of civilization that we carry on with us. And if they are not carrying on this kind of values and legal structures, they have to be condemned or to put straight right. And this implicit universalization of whatever comes out of our minds, of our Western minds, is something that we should allow for and take into account more, and in these times much more seriously than we did in the past, for many reasons.
Actually, now I missed everything. We moved from rights to the state now, or?
No, we were just, since Sonia raised a question in the chat that was about a bottom-up approach to human rights, local human rights tradition, Charte du Mandé in Mali, Ubuntu in South Africa, way to reappropriate locally human rights with a bottom-up approach. And so Mauro was giving a feedback about
okay, because I was kicked out, I'm now new in the chat again, so I don't see the former chat. Yeah.
Sorry, this was the topic. So well, no, I was thinking, I mean, unless you want to react on this bottom-up approach to human rights.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the point is, as I also said this morning, we need a bottom-up approach in the sense of asking people what they want. And there is also empirical anthropological research. I mentioned the big project, World Value Survey, polling people in different cultures. And this is, however, it is a project which started in Sweden, which is now US based, with the famous anthropologist Engelhardt. And over the years, the findings are that when the societies change and the living conditions change, that then the preferences also change. And I find it totally plausible that when you don't have anything to eat, and if you have no roof, and if you must be aware of being of criminality everywhere, then you want security most of all. But when you live in a place where security is there, and when you have enough to eat, then people cherish other values which could be labeled more autonomistic values, that they want more choices, etc. That's the finding of this research. I'm not a sociologist. I cannot assess the methods, whether they are correct, but I think they are plausible, and it's really an interesting project to follow. And also I have a remark, of course, on the state equality or inequality, which Mauro mentioned, but I don't know whether that is relevant now or whether Valentina wants to guide us
please
further.
go ahead. No, of course, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Mauro, you mentioned the principle of sovereign equality as the basic principle of the United Nations Charter. And of course, we have to distinguish between the formal equality under the law as a legal position which compels, for example, that each state has one vote in the General Assembly and that each state has a similar vote when it comes to accessing or concluding a treaty. One state, one vote. Of course, the states are hugely unequal in material power, wealth, military strength, economic strength, and as you surely also said this afternoon, this power is currently shifting, in the process of shifting, that China will be the biggest economy soon, etc., etc. But there still is a value in this principle of formal equality. And this doesn't mean that the states must be schematically treated equally in all respects. And we know that, for example, in treaty regimes, main example, United Nations Charter, there is a privilege for some few states, the P5, they have different legal means at their disposal. And therefore you could say, oh, they are more equal than the rest, they are unequal. But then comes the positivist response. Well, the states agreed to that when they acceded the United Nations and when they created the charter. And therefore, they have accepted this privilege. If they hadn't accepted it, the United Nations wouldn't have come into being in the first place. But then you can respond, okay, why did they accept? Because they were so weak, because they were pulled across the table, because they had no choice. Huh? So that's the problem of material inequality, how you see it in international relations. And unlike in your dear private law, where you have in the civil law, I guess also in Italy and France, like in Germany, if you have contracts between very unequal partners, that they're so blatantly unfair and unequal that it's unbearable, contra ordre public, then these contracts will be annulled by a court. But that's the lacuna in international law. That doesn't exist. The treaties, how unequal and unfair they may be, they are considered as formally valid. And I think that's the interesting point.
Of course, this is not a point treated, I mean, in international law. Has never been addressed, I mean, properly. But there is
yeah, but it's historically a big issue that for China, for example, the legacy of being subjected to the unequal treaties is still very much, and they are drawing a lot of political capital about it. I mean, now about this national humiliation 100 years ago, I think, okay, it was patently unfair. It was a humiliation, but I don't know whether it's such a future-looking good argument to base not everything, but so much on that.
Let the Chinese decide on it. We cannot decide for them.
Yeah, right.
Sure. I have just a footnote of what you said about the World Values Project. I like this. I like the Englot, I mean, study scholarship, because it's very, very good. But the point is that this project, as nice as it can be, works on a basis of 400,000 respondents, more or less. I can be wrong by a decade, by 10,000. And speaking of world values, having 400,000 respondents out of 8 billion people, I still think that is something that wants to sell something that is of a different quality compared to the expectations. And what I don't know, because I simply don't know, is if the respondents are English-speaking people. Because, the elites speak English around the world, not necessarily grassroots do. And so if you want to gather and collect and master together word value and studying and selecting and differentiating them, I mean, this could be a radical flaw in your analysis. But this was just a footnote. You mentioned the passing.
I would like to go back maybe because I think I would keep other 15 minutes max, and then we will give the floor to the audience, and to go to the second leg of the liberal paradigm, that is democracy, that remain a bit in the background of our conversations today, and somehow I think has been at the core of your reflection, because how democratized international law is part of the global constitutionalist discourse, is part of the comparative law dilemma, all right, between the West and the rest. I want to have a reflection from you concerning the democratic hybris that we had a couple of decades ago that seems completely fading away today, and the democratic fatigue instead that we see at both the national and international level, and if you think we should still need a global ambition for democracy, or if it's completely misplaced. We saw, for example, how changed the UN attitude towards democracy promotion in the past few years.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, we all know that according to the indicia like Freedom House and so on, that the decade of democratic expansion, that this is over, that there has been a retreat, that states, a lesser number of states are qualified democratic. You can criticize, of course, these parameters and so on, but roughly speaking, the tendency is clear and nobody contests it. And that there is particularly also the erosion of democracies from within, like Hungary, Poland, maybe even United States, that leaders hijack democratic institutions and then use them to turn a democracy into something else. So that is, I think, an uncontested fact. Now the question is, what does that mean for our aspirations? And I think that nevertheless, it is still a fact that, for example, democracies do not go to war against each other. So the democratic peace thesis empirically holds if there are two democracies on both sides, not the United States against Iraq or so, but if there is a dyad of democratic states. And this, I think, this simple fact, details are controversial, but I think it's pretty sound empirically. This simple fact speaks in favor of democracy as a stabilizing and peacemaking factor.
Mauro?
I don't know. I agree with Anna on the fact that, on the empirical fact, that is telling, by the way, that is telling that usually democracies do not go to war against themselves. This does not prevent, of course, radical conflicts within the democracies, but I have, and I've written about it, the same position that on democracy that I have on rule of law. If we want to expand, if not export, transplant democracy outside the West, we need to understand what are the foundations of our democracies. How were they born? How were they developed? How have they become what they are today? And very little of this analysis, of this kind of analysis, have been made. The literature on democracy and the export is filled up with naive analysis, and yet they take libraries, they take shelves, miles and miles of shelves in the libraries, speaking of electoral systems, of representations, of constitutions, and we simply know that all this can be foundational to the democracy, but it's not at all enough to make them rise and to make them leave. So. And I would need 3 hours, but I always add to this my sketchy remarks the fact that what what Valentina, and not only Valentina, has called the Liberal Trinity, and the adjective is much, much more telling than the noun in this expression, should be considered actually as a quadrivium, because what you always find in the document, for instance, for not only of the EU, but I want to stress that you can find 1,000 times in documents issued by the US Department of State, is the connection between rule of law, free market, human rights, and democracy. And they're always pointed out as the foundational pillars of the foreign policy of the United States, and the pursuit of this for targets, so to speak, are co-essential, foundational for the protection of US economic and geopolitical interests. So this kind of remark entails all the rest of the answer that I have no time to.
I would briefly like to add something to that. I agree that there should be a fourth pillar, and that, for example, in the French revolutionary tradition, there is, of course, a fourth pillar, even if it's not mentioned, namely fraternité. Fraternité, brotherhood, sisterhood, solidarity, that is the fourth pillar, and that can also be traced to the roots. And I think that our globalization fatigue and the problem that the promises of globalization have exactly not reached the lower segments who have not benefited, but then instead created a layer of super rich people, and the externalities, destruction of environment, etc. All this came upon the poorer worker and inhabitants of landscapes where companies were put. All this shows adamantly that this fourth pillar, namely social element, is absolutely necessary to be strengthened. And now concerning what Mauro said, that the free market, which is always mentioned, that may be the case. I wasn't so aware of that, but it's currently now very much acknowledged, or there is a lot of literature about the association between expansion of capitalism and constitutionalism, human rights, democracy. But I think here we really have to pay attention to not essentializing the West. Mauro, you give a lot of examples about the United States, but I think there are significant differences between the European tradition, although of course, even in Europe, you have Scandinavian states with a much stronger welfarist tradition, whereas the southern states with a different religious influence and so on. But I think in many very important respects for our discourse, we really have to set the United States apart. Not only with regard to free market, no social protection, also, for example, data protection. Mauro, you mentioned digitalization. We all have these problems with the European data regulation. The US doesn't. So there are really deep differences in the so-called West.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you with the usual refinement. I mean, yeah, because if you go through the EU document this time, it's true, you don't find the free market as a requirement for the EU policy, internal and external. But you find the rule of law, human rights, and democracy exactly in the same terms you find them in the US documents. My point is that the European tradition, the cultural tradition, not only the legal, there is a legal continental tradition that we should resurface one way or another. But this is for another seminar. But the European cultural tradition has not been able in the 70 years that from the World War II to build not only a narrative and language, but also a set of values that underpin a different language and different narrative, different from the US. If you go through, and you do better than I do, the EU documents about external policy, but also related many issues in the domestic arena of the EU, you find that the language, the expression, rule of law, human rights, democracy, as if they were, commodities, as I said in this afternoon, as if they were, one could speak about them without history and geography, without not to mention anthropology that you mentioned and I insisted on this afternoon. So I'm disappointed by this lack of forward-looking and at the same time backwards looking to our history that the EU has been showing for decades and still showing, That was my refinement.
Thanks. And actually I have many questions, but I will definitely cut, and I will just finish with a more substantial maybe question and then two more personal questions before to give the floor to the rest. And if, of course, we can continue later. But something that I think emerged in both your presentation is, to use Nanni Moretti expression, is that le parole sono importanti, so the words are important. Language impact our capacity of thinking and imagining the world. And in reality, all our vocabulary to think law and politics, it's impossible without Western concepts. That became, of course, universal concept: democracy, republic, constitutionalism. And so I wanted to ask you also, Anna this morning also was mentioning Wittgenstein, is not the language the most subtle and pervasive form of hegemony? I mean, it's really consenting to think the world and limiting the understanding of the world for the rest. Since it's also one way in any case, we don't really know the other way around. I mean, yesterday Badi was mentioning some African language, I think, to express some concept that was definitely autochthonous and absolutely new to us. So this capacity of imagination that passes through language then somehow became one way in the world.
Mauro, go first.
Anne, excuse me, because I will be very short. I think that going in favor or against the lingua franca is something as completely meaningless. Latin has been the lingua franca first for elite and grassroots, and then only for elite, but for 16 centuries. And we could say that in Europe, and Latin has certainly shaped our view of not only narrating, speaking of the word, but also of looking at the word. Mm-hmm. And now at least through the elites, which were the ones who has been handing over culture legacies through generations, because they were the ones able to write and read. So we are sons and grandsons and grand-grandsons and grand-granddaughters of that way of looking at the world. And now it's English for the time being, and certainly in most of the world. But as everybody who has traveled in East Asia can confirm, Chinese is already lingua franca in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, in part of Thailand, not to mention, of course, Taiwan, Singapore. If you look at it, one usually thinks of Singapore as a Western hub in East Asia. I personally have experienced more difficult to speak in the streets in English in Singapore than I found in Hanoi, in Hanoi or in Ho Chi Minh City or in Phnom Penh or in Siem Reap. So that's my simple point.
Thanks.
I hadn't understood your question as pointing to the question of English language hegemony, but I was thinking actually of the whole discourse about law as language and pointing to the langage and all that stuff. So I have three remarks on that. First of all, I think that human thought is not inevitably tied to language. We have a lot of nonverbal thinking. Otherwise, it would not be possible to learn speaking if you could not think before. On the other hand, I think law is really special because law consists of texts. It doesn't consist of numbers. It consists of text in natural language with words. And we have built a system, a legal system. We attribute authority to words and so on. So it is not, I think it's really a special field, the field of law, because of its textual character. Animals also have language, huh? So there are different types of way languages, but these languages are, I think, much less sophisticated than the human language. So whales could not build a culture and dominate the rest of the world, and for many reasons. And one reason may be that the communication is not sophisticated enough to create real huge buildings of thought. I think the interesting point I find is that the law as a system, it's completely imaginary. It's only in our imagination. And so I have now started to learn a bit of Chinese, which is very difficult for me, and which gives very interesting insights about what things are important, how to express things, what is not important, and so on. So just as a personal point.
Yeah, it was about thinking the law. And okay, just two more personal questions. Why you choose to study law? Why you choose to become an international lawyer or a comparative lawyer, respectively? And what are...
Now we have the problem. Mauro is back. Yeah.
Okay. Anne?
So Valentina asked why we study law. I don't know whether you heard it.
This was maybe more on the to closure, but Sonia has a more substantial question probably that we would like to address is how are you positioned? What is your opinion with post-colonialist and the colonial currents? Do they exist in law? Are they developed in your countries?
Well, post-colonialism is very much en vogue now in law. It has, it's totally fashionable, one could say. And I think it's, in Germany, for example, the debate has only started now, fairly recently. And I think that has to do with the fact that Germany had comparatively fewer colonies, shorter time, etc. Second, Germany had historically very big problems in the 20th century after colonialism, which kind of effaced the issues with the Nama and Herero, for example, in German Southwest Africa. But it's now coming to the fore with quite some strength.
May I?
Yeah, please, your turn.
No, just a few remarks. That true post-colonialism is a very fashionable issue, especially in international law. Not only, but especially in international law. But I think we should again make clear that we cannot speak of one issue as if it were one, when instead it's at least two. Meaning what? Meaning that one thing is post-colonialism as studying the period of time after the demise of physical colonial power over the nations situated, located, societies located outside the West. And one thing is to think of post-colonialism in terms of demise of the Western grasp over the political, economic, and legal language affecting the international scenario. Meaning what? Meaning that we have experienced for 3 or 4 decades, at least, at the very least, a sort of colonial power made up of economy, military power, legal power over all the rest, to name it in the terms of this masterclass, outside the West. And this is not over. This is not completely over, but it has taken different shapes because there are more and more phenomena showing the resilience or the resistance or the abandonment of this kind of colonialism, and it should be studied as it is, as the way the world takes shape beside and beyond the Western wishes. This was my remarks about post-colonialism.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
And I still add a very short remark on that. It is, of course, a fact that there is an informal colonialism ongoing in the sense of economic pressure, political pressure, and so on. However, we should also take into account that the bad situation of many communities in the global south is a mixture of various factors. It is not only the colonial legacy. It is surely also the colonial legacy, but there are a lot of other also internal factors contributing to the difficult situation many states find themselves in. And the fact that many people just want to move out of these states and go away says something, I think. It is a voting with the feet also. And I think the problem is, and this brings us back to the shape of the state, that maybe the export product of the state has never really functioned elsewhere, in the sense Mauro also mentioned that people are loyal to other types of groups, and that it is very difficult to establish an infrastructure and administration which considers all the entirety of the population instead of serving certain groups and so on. And where that works badly, then there are a lot of people left out and they want to go away. And they do that. And there is, of course, also, I think the Western stage would seek to protect themselves, to speak very bluntly. There is always the policy of trying to motivate people to return, improving the prospects in the place where people are, and so on. Whatever you think of that, there, among the ruling and corrupt elites in those countries, there is not a big motivation to improve the fate of their populations, because there have they bank accounts in Geneva. Okay, Geneva and Switzerland contributes to that by offering the bank accounts. They go shopping in Paris, etc. They don't care a damn for the villagers.
Thanks, Anne. I think I will continue my questions later on, and I would instead immediately giving the floor to the questions we have in the chat, and maybe we can continue later. There is Muhammad, who intervened this morning, who has 2 questions that I will read. Muhammad asks, concerning human rights in international law, why do you think that when there is controversy between different human rights, the first generation of human rights will always prevail? What makes the first generation of human rights have a greater impact than the second generation of human rights? For example, the right to property, investment against the right to have drinking water, as in Bolivia. And the second question of Muhammad, who is a student at S.A.R in Lille from Malaysia. Do you consider third world approaches to international law, and this is a bit in the line of what we are discussing so far, to be the most comprehensive and holistic in terms of design and context of legal systems compared to liberal and realist approaches to international law?
Wait a minute, can you read that again? I didn't fully get the meaning.
Do you consider third world approaches to international law to be the most comprehensive and holistic in terms of design and context of legal systems compared to the liberal and realist approaches to international law? So if the third world approaches to international law are somehow better compared to liberal and realist approaches to international law?
Okay. Mauro, do you want to start or should I start?
Yeah, I would start simply because I have a very partial answer to the first question. I have no answer to the second, which are in both of these questions are more in your turf. Just a remark concerning the first question about the prevalence of the first human rights generation over the so-called second and third right. Second and third human rights generation, simply because the first generation of human rights included rights which were at the very core of the Washington Consensus, at the very core of the rule of business law as propagated and target of the attempt of exporting by the West, especially by the US. So this is, in my view, what explains the prevalence in the global discourse of the first generation of human rights. That's it. Anna.
Thank you. Can I add something to that?
Of course.
I think that the concept of rights is very closely attached to remedies. So many people think that no rights without remedy. The English legal tradition, and Mauro can correct me maybe on that, is even looking first at the remedy and then like deducing the right from the existence of the remedy. So a very much procedural way of looking. And that means that for having a real right, it is very important to be able to enforce it in court. And many people say, well, that's what makes a right a right. And it is, I think, a matter of fact that it is more difficult for judges, for courts to deal with social and cultural rights because they involve much more budgetary considerations on a much larger scale. It's not to say that political rights don't cost anything. They also need infrastructure, etc. But it is the structure of social rights, also in the international codification, is different. For example, there is the clause in the social covenant which says that states commit to progressively implementing the right to housing, the right to satisfactory status of health, the right to work. And I think the legal texts take into account that, in fact, you can't implement these rights in the same way. And it is particularly difficult for courts. And now I don't say that there is a hierarchy, Valentina. I just say that there is a difference. We can really say, you can say that in many ways, the social rights are more important than the political rights, but they are more difficult to enforce in court. And I think that's the main explanation. Now, I think that with regard to the whole investment protection, as opposed to, let's say, right to water in Latin America specifically, there is now a strong move in the sense of taking into account the rights of the population. And we have, for example, the arbitration Urbasa against Argentina, in which the investment tribunal acknowledged that the investor is bound by the human right to water, but only in the sense of negatively abstaining from interfering and not positively securing water. So the trend is in the direction of more emphasis on the social rights.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Mauro. We have Camilla Roberti.
We have the second question about third world approaches. Well, I think that it's impossible to answer which approach or perspective is better. In the morning, I used the word multi-perspectivism. It's important to acknowledge that you, in your analysis and understanding of the world and in your normative assessment of what's going on, that you are coming from a certain standpoint, that you have a Vorverständnis, hermeneutically speaking, and you have to become aware of that and you have to realize that all others have their standpoint too. And if you try to see the world also through the eyes of others, which will never be perfectly possible because you have your baggage, but if you try, you will get a fuller picture of what's going on. And that's why, for example, we have this interview here because Mauro has a different perspective than I have. And if you hear us together, then you will get a fuller picture than if you hear only one of us.
I cannot say it better. Camilla Roberti, I think from Italy. So Camilla says, good evening. Thank you for this interesting webinar. I have a question on democracies as stabilizing and peacemaking factors. If it is true that democracies don't wage war against each other, we also witness weaponized trends. Current increasing arms exports from France and Italy to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, to name a few examples, show how European democratic countries can actually contribute to destabilization at the very last of non-European regions. Having considered all these, wouldn't a less westernized perspective be useful in assessing democracies as peacekeeping actors? Thank you in advance for your answers. Thanks, Camilla, for this beautiful question.
Yeah, short answer. That is a very sad and true fact, and it is scandalous, I think. It is really evil, the weapon export, which is done in order to create and secure the jobs in our countries. And there are strong lobbyists, and the weapon industry is often also a state industry. So it's connected to the state. These are big state firms, also, for example, in Switzerland. So it's not so much the bad capitalists, but these are the states themselves which secure the jobs and then export the weapons. But actually, it only confirms what I said before, namely that in the relationship between democratic and undemocratic states, there is no peacemaking effect. The exportation is a substitute for directly going to war to an undemocratic state, you could say, it's parallel. So the peace and stabilizing function works only among democracies. And the exports we have are from democracies to non-democracies.
I simply subscribe to each word and syllable that Anna said.
Thanks.
You see, at this point, we are fully 1,000% again.
That's great. So, Kaisa Kvitonda asked, what does happen when a country legal system disrespects fundamental rights? So it's a bit of a big question.
What has happened or what should happen?
That's the real question.
Yes, probably what should happen, probably. It's
okay, Mauro, you could go first.
Mauro, very simple. If the state is a signatory to any international convention charter, and there are thousands, the state should implement this charter, and the right, including this charter, through its own courts. So the human right, whatever it is, I mean, I have many caveats and refinements to the inflation of human rights, and we already spoke about that. But if a state is complying with its own promises and it's a signatory of a international convention, international instrument, asserting the right to X or Y or Z, it should implement this right through the court. Then, of course, Anne is 100% right when she says that, look, be aware that there are rights that are costly and there are rights that are super costly to implement. And I add to this crystal clear truth that some rights are costly for the society at large, and some rights are costly for some specific sector of the society at large. But the point is still the same. So that short answer, the state should implement through its judiciary the rights, including a charter is a signatory to.
Thanks to our speakers. Maybe I would ask Noémie to switch on the cameras or at least the micro of Charlotte and Trevor, who would like to ask 2 questions. Maybe we can also see them. Charlotte, can you hear us?
Yes, I've been able to activate my microphone, but not my camera.
Okay.
Hello, thank you for the wonderful debate so far. I'm an Australian lawyer, but I'm studying human rights here now in Lille through the master's program. So I probably bring an Australian perspective to this, and my question relates to perceptions of China, in particular the response to its economic rise in the last decade, and come obviously from a country which has had a strong focus on accommodating China economically in the last decade and slowly replacing European languages with Mandarin, although that might have imploded a bit in the last few months. But notwithstanding that China's human rights record is obviously quite abysmal, but given that there are very few states that can claim a clean human rights record, if any, I wondered what is your opinion as legal scholars on states' impetus for having this wide and unified opposition to China's economic rise, whether there is an actual fear that the westernized legal system and the rule of law is going to be replaced or affected, or is it simply a reluctance led by the US to secede economic political power? Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Anna, what, you want to start? Because I'm not sure that having fully understood the question.
Yeah, me neither. I think that, Charlotte, your premise seems to be that there is real hostility and jealousy against the rise of China, and that you suspect that it has to do just that it is a power play, a fear of losing influence.
Yes, and just in the selective approach of countries to its human rights record, for example, invoking sanctions.
Well, maybe this is not a response, but one observation to your remark that hardly any state has a clean human rights record. I think that this fact changes nothing in the responsibility to criticize China or other human rights violators. However bad other states are, that is simply no argument, I think, should not be a race to the bottom. Of course, it makes it difficult for the governors of these states to criticize China, because then China will respond that they have clean, dirty hands. But from the perspective of, let's say, scholarly analysis, this is no argument. And I think that in the long run, also Western states, including the United States, which are losing economic and political power, relatively speaking, would be in their own self-interest happier with a China which is completely transparent, human rights abiding, and so on, because this would mean that it is a more reliable partner. Just take now on the pandemic. I mean, everybody speculates about how many deaths there are really in China. Nobody believes that there are only 5,000, and that there was no transparency at the beginning. It is clear that at the beginning, the people, the doctors who issued a wake-up call, they were reprimanded. They had to sign, shut up. So these are all problems. I don't say that these problems do not happen elsewhere, but it's now difficult to compare. But the world would be better off if the situation would be more transparent, I think. Everybody would be happy about that.
Yeah, I agree with what Anna said. I'm worried that I am too often in full agreement with Anna. not because I don't love her, because I do, but because we have a usually different perspective that are that are more self-nourishing one to the other than I thought. And
yeah, maybe we are learning something.
Yeah, maybe you're right. I only, once being said that I agree with you, I wanted just to add a remark to, again, as Anna said, an observation more than an answer. when Charlotte speaks of human rights, again, as I said this afternoon, one should ask which human rights you're talking about. There are too many. If you speak of death penalty, there's another big Western country which keeps having the death penalty in the majority of the states. You speak about torture. Again, I mean, we Europeans have long pretended not to raise this issue. I speak in institutional terms. The European Union should have arisen this issue with the US, with the tortures memo and all the Guantanamo violations of any kind of basic human rights. We have not done that. We're still not doing that, but we are ready to reproach China. I'm fine with it. And as I said, I am in agreement with Anna. But we should be aware that, as I said, rule of law, human rights, democracy. I said something this afternoon about that, and I wrote elsewhere about this. Rule of law, democracy, human rights are Western-born notions and concepts. And we want to export this because we think that we are the best and everybody should follow us. That's fine. I can be fine with that. But we cannot overlook, as scholars at least, I'm not speaking as a politician because I'm not, but as scholars, we cannot overlook history, culture, anthropology, legal tradition, legal frameworks, and whatever makes a culture what it is. And so China, as the United States, have different cultures from ours, at least partially. And on these cultures, they have built a legal infrastructure which includes death penalty and torture in a way that no German, no Italian, no French could even, in abstract accept, even in abstract terms accept, but they do. They do. So, I mean, we should place every line of arguments, every line of reasoning within historical and cultural context, even when we speak of human rights.
Mauro, can I follow up on this before to give the floor?
I have to say something.
Okay, yeah.
Of course, I agree that we have to place our arguments, our reflection in the cultural context, and first of all, understand the different situation in other countries. However, I would not like to be blind in the sense that culture can excuse everything. The one thing is the analytics, as you mentioned. We have to understand that. The other thing is the question whether we can nevertheless evaluate a culture from the perspective of those who suffer inside the culture. Mm-hmm. If in Saudi Arabia, women were not allowed to drive a car, as I said, then ask them whether they want to drive a car and not their husbands. When women in Switzerland were not allowed to vote until the 1970s, ask them whether they want to vote and not their husbands.
Excuse me, Anna, the last canton to allow
was 1990, I know, yeah.
96.
Yeah,
96.
I know. Appenzell, Ausserrhoden.
Right.
So only because something was a culture doesn't mean that it's good, because cultures change all the time. And they change through various influences, also from the outside, also from the inside. And I think that we just have to acknowledge the fact that some cultures were bad. Culture is always about the oppression of some weaker members of society, starting with women over children to animals, and they benefit the ones who have the say. And we have to criticize that. And of course, the people most of all have to speak for themselves, but sometimes weaker members suffering from so-called cultures, they can't speak for themselves, for example, animals. So they need some advocates to do that.
Yeah, my question was in the sense of what Anna said. I mean, is not the result of this discourse a very deterministic reading of, you know, societies in the world that, you know, someone is doomed to have a certain destiny because he's born in a certain part of the world, because he is from a certain history, he's from a certain, you know, background, and then at the end ends up for having privileges from one side that can enjoy freedom, democracy, other thing, and the rest that has, you know, to live with that.
Yeah, I think really maybe, Mauro, you want to start on that?
No, go ahead.
No, that is the problem, that we must be wary of seeing having such a deterministic picture of the course of history. I mean, I'm not a historian, but roughly speaking, I would say that there are paradigms or approaches which look more at the structure, the so-called structure, and others which look more at individual agents. And I think, just from my personal life experiences and from examining the course of history, that individuals and groups of humans can really make a difference, and that you cannot attribute the course of events to a system or the structure, because there are humans which have to act inside the system. And therefore, it is also not deterministic, but can change through human behavior. And that requires a learning experience. And that's, for example, why we're talking here now. Learning is the key.
Oh, yeah. I am on the same line, but and I certainly refuse any approach of the kind that Valentina called the deterministic, and anthropologists called essentialist, fixing in a sort of a diapositive the kind of reality we want to study. No, cultures change, the law change, values change. Of course, the path of change can be very different. A statute can be erased by the stroke of a pen, and the cultural beliefs and attitudes take much more time. And as Anna said, the changes come from inside, come from outside, come from a stray between inside and outside. There are different mechanisms that drove the history of any society, any society. I also agree with the point made by Anna when she said that there are a group of people who trigger, she didn't use these words, but I think she meant that, who trigger the change, who can in a way accelerate something that can be already in movement, but needed a kicking point, a kicking off to be put in on the road. I agree with it. My only refinement is that the idea of a group of people which was born as a minority in a society or in a community or in a state society, wherever, can become majoritarian and so promote the change in the culture, in the legal framework, in the legislation, when the rest of the people have sufficient incentives to accept or to support that change. But don't get me wrong, the incentives can be cultural, political, economic, of various kinds. But what I want to say is that not because there is a group of enlightened people, of elite intellectuals of any sort that sees the change, looking forward, this kind of change will be necessarily supported by the rest of the people. the rest of the people has to be persuaded, and to be persuaded, most of the times they need incentives. It can be cultural, social, economic, of different kinds. It has to be, the change has to be supported by the large part of society.
Thanks, Mauro. We have a final question, I would say, at this point from Trevor and then from Sonia, because they go in the same direction of the multi-perspectivism that we were evoking today. Trevor.
Yes, hello, thank you. I think Professor Bussani actually was just touching on this a little bit, but I wanted to go back to what Professor Peters was talking about earlier in our first session with her today about the idea of multi-perspectivism, and particularly the example of incorporating carnism into our language instead of just, saying veganism and everyone else's quote unquote normal. I thought that was really interesting because I think that there can really be a parallel found between that and, for example, the question of talking about pronouns and gender identity and using language and, using language like this in a different way and incorporating a multi-perspectivist example. However, unfortunately, it seems like there's been a lot of pushback and backlash to this, especially in my perspective in the United States. And so I was wondering, how would you respond to any potential backlash from this incorporation of a more multi-perspectivist vision?
And I just would like to complete, because I think it's a very interesting question. Maybe to know from where do you think, or from which side do you think that the backlash could come? Everybody agreed with multi-perspectivism vision, I believe, but don't do it. For example, in international relations, everybody's agreed, but with a global perspective. But only international relations scholars with a specialty in a region on an area studies will really try to do it. So how to manage this gap?
Trevor, I think that the problem of normalization and thereby making your standpoint invisible, the male standpoint, the Karanist standpoint, the Western standpoint, is not exactly the same as the issue of identity, politics, gender, and so on. For example, I think it's very important to say, although I didn't say that this morning, I do not want to eat meat. That is my attitude and my practice and my decision. And I don't say I am a vegan, because this would be in a way much too inflexible. It's not, although it does constitute my identity, but I think what matters much more is what I do and how I approach things as opposed to what I am. I mean, I am a multiplicity of many features and factors and roles depending on time and context and so on. And I think that is the problem with this identity stuff, that it is inflexible and fixed and polarizing, as opposed to emphasizing that people have different jobs and different outlooks in different periods of their life, and depending on what profession and where they are, etc., and that they can change and are flexible and can learn something. So that's the difference. Now, and Sonia, yeah, the quest for decentering our perspective, and as you know, of course, as this Indian scholar Chakrabarti said, the provincialization of Europe, it is, and that is then the fundamental critique which is voiced against what I try to say, that this will be always never perfect, never ending, that it will always be doomed to fail because we'll never be able to reach it, even if we want to. And I think then this argument is, in a way, you don't have to take it too seriously, but just have to acknowledge that, of course, your aspirations will be imperfect and doomed to fail, and that you will never, also, for example, as a comparative lawyer, Mauro can surely knows that much better, you will never be equally familiar with various legal orders. You will always be better and much more rooted in where you studied from scratch and so on. But I think that that doesn't mean that you're not allowed to say anything on comparative law or so, because it's inevitably imperfect. You just have to lay that open and also acknowledge it to yourself. And more is not possible because we're all human.
Thanks. Mauro, you want to follow up on some points? Yeah.
No, I agree with Anna.
Okay.
Peaceful conclusion.
I cannot pretend to be in disagreement when I
No, but we are really happy to have this kind of ecumenical
No, not ecumenical. I think that if we went on for a couple of hours, we will find a lot of the point of disagreement. But
we have to come together, not only on screen and go out for a drink and Lille and so on.
Totally right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You see, I agree on this too.
Deal. But for the moment, I really want to thank you very much for having been with us in this long and passionate day. I hope, and I'm sure actually that the student had so much. Yes, thank you very much. Really, I personally had a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I really loved all this day where there's been such a dense exchange and so many different perspectives. And I think we all learned a lot. So I'm really sincere in thanking you very much for your time, availability, and sharing your knowledge with us. And I'm sure this is also the thank of our students and all the participants. And as Mauro said and Anna said, this is just, an aperitif. We will do our conversation in person. Yeah.
In September.
Yeah, hopefully we plan, or this September or the next one. We definitely have to do it in person and continue our conversation. So thanks a lot. It's been a wonderful day.
Thank you.
I give the floor to Sonia to announce the day of tomorrow.
Oh yes, of course, I forget. Donc demain, on passe en français et donc on aura une journée en histoire, puisque donc le matin, nous accueillons Thomas Hippler, qui est professeur d'histoire contemporaine à l'Université de Caen et qui est allemand. Et voilà. Et donc, il viendra nous parler pour une histoire globale de la paix, donc une intention d'avoir un jour une histoire globale de la paix. Et ce qui est intéressant, c'est que je pense qu'il va revenir sur un point qu'on a entendu aujourd'hui, qu'on a entendu hier, justement sur la traduction, sur la langue, sur l'interprétation des termes et des concepts. Donc, il va sûrement nous parler de ça. Et on va passer en pratique, en quelque sorte, l'après-midi, puisqu'on aura une table ronde avec 2 autres historiens qui, eux, travaillent sur des communautés différentes du Sahel, qui sont parvenus à créer de la paix. On verra comment on le définit. Et donc, on va vraiment aller dans le terrain, très, très proche. Voilà, ça nous fera déjà une bonne journée avec 2 conférences.
9h30
9h30 demain, pardon. 9h30, 11h30 et 14h l'après-midi.
Il y a webinaire numéro 3 demain.
3.
Vous avez les links. Merci encore à nos intervenants. Une belle soirée.
Merci Valentina, Sonia. Ciao Mauro, un piacere.
A presto. A presto.
Molto dopo. Ciao.
Pace.
Buona serata.
Ciao, buona serata.
Ciao.
The very right to be human is denied every day to hundreds of millions of people.
Dans ce temple des Nations Unies, nous sommes les gardiens d'un idéal. Nous sommes les gardiens d'une conscience. La lourde responsabilité et l'immense honneur qui sont les nôtres doivent nous conduire à donner la priorité au désarmement dans la paix.
We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop.
Chaque génération, sans doute, se croit vouée à refaire le monde. La mienne sait pourtant qu'elle ne le refera pas. Mais sa tâche est peut-être plus grande. Elle consiste à empêcher que le monde se défasse.